In July 1944, Germany's entire aircraft industry was being reorganized, retooled, and put on emergency footing, all to hit a target of 3,000 fighter planes a month. That same month, American factories built 8,464 aircraft. That number, 8,464 inches 1 month, is bigger than Germany's annual output for 1,939. By the end of 1944, the United States had delivered 95,272 military aircraft. Germany produced somewhere between 35,000 and 40,000. And here is the part that most people never think about. Germany's high command knew these figures. The actual production numbers were available to Hitler and Hermann Göring through intelligence channels, through careful reading of American industrial publications, through their own analysts. They looked at them and declared them impossible. What happened next across the next 18 months is the story of what it looks like when a military force tries to fight a production war it has already decided cannot be real. On the 14th of October 1943, 291 American B-17 Flying Fortresses crossed into Germany heading for the ball-bearing factories at Schweinfurt. The Luftwaffe knew they were coming. 60 B-17s never came back. Another 17 landed in such bad shape they never flew again. Out of 594 crew listed as missing that day, only 65 survived as prisoners of war. The Luftwaffe lost 35 aircraft. That day settled something in American military thinking, though it took a few weeks to admit it. The theory that a sufficiently armed bomber could defend itself against fighters, that a tight formation of B-17s with their combined fields of fire could beat any interceptor, had just been disproved at a cost of approximately 650 men. The 8th Air Force quietly stopped flying deep into Germany. Missions were restricted to targets within range of the P-47 Thunderbolt escort fighter, which could follow bombers to the German border near Aachen and no further. Beyond Aachen, the bombers flew alone. This was the problem that would, within 6 months, be solved by an engineer named Edgar Schmood, working in Inglewood, California, and a test pilot named Ronald Harker, who flew an experimental aircraft at a British airfield on the 30th of April 1942, and noticed something worth reporting to his employer, Rolls-Royce. But before the solution, it is worth sitting with the problem, because the problem explains everything that follows. The Luftwaffe in late 1943 was not a broken force. Its pilots were experienced, its tactics were sharp, and its equipment, particularly the Focke-Wulf Tevel 190, was genuinely dangerous. What Göring told his commanders after Black Thursday felt true. The skies over Germany were still German skies. Deep American penetrations were suicidal. The escort fighters couldn't get there. The unescorted bombers died in the hundreds. Germany had figured out how to defend its airspace against the most powerful bomber force ever assembled, and the Americans had not yet found an answer. They had, however, already built one. They just hadn't understood what they had. The North American P-51 Mustang was designed in 1940 for the British, who needed a fighter fast enough that the prototype was requested to be completed in 120 days. North American aviation's chief designer, Edgar Schmood, an Austrian-born engineer who had immigrated to the United States via Brazil in 1939, delivered the design ahead of schedule. The aircraft flew in October 1940. The British were impressed by its low-altitude performance and its range. At high altitude, however, the Allison engine it carried ran out of breath. Above 15,000 feet, the Mustang was mediocre, and no one in American command circles was particularly excited about it. On the 30th of April 1942, a Rolls-Royce test pilot named Ronald Harker flew an Allison-powered Mustang at Duxford. He wrote up his observations afterward and included a suggestion: fit this airframe with the Merlin 61, the same engine going into the new Spitfire variants. The Merlin had a two-stage supercharger designed by an engineer named Stanley Hooker. Above 20,000 feet, that supercharger kept the engine breathing when nothing else could. Harker's note made its way up the chain. On the 13th of October 1942, the first Merlin-powered Mustang flew at Hucknall and reached 441 miles per hour at 29,800 feet over 100 miles per hour, faster than the Allison version at that altitude, with roughly twice the climb rate. The American variant, the XP-51B, flew on the 30th of November 1942. North American built 15,586 of them across the war, and in 1944 alone, 7,966 P-51s came out of Inglewood, California. The aircraft that would break the Luftwaffe's back was already being mass-produced, while Goering was declaring victory over the unescorted bombers. The 354th Fighter Group arrived in England on the 1st of November, 1943, 2.5 weeks after Black Thursday, and flew its first P-51B combat mission on December 1. On December 13, P-51S escorted bombers all the way to Kiel, 490 miles inside Germany. The P-47 Thunderbolt could escort to roughly the German border. The P-51, with its drop tanks and its fuel efficiency of 3.3 miles per gallon compared to the P-47's 1.8, could fly to Berlin and still have enough fuel to chase Luftwaffe fighters on the way home. The first P-51 escort mission to Berlin came on the 4th of March 1944. 2 days later, more than 700 American bombers attacked the German capital in daylight for the first time, escorted by over 800 fighters. The Luftwaffe lost approximately 160 aircraft in that 2-day period. Goering called his commanders in afterward. When he was informed that long-range American fighters had been shot down over Aachen, proof that U.S. fighter escorts were reaching deep into the Reich, he refused to believe it. The exchange was witnessed by Albert Speer and later recorded in his memoir. Galland told Goering about the American fighters. Goering told him it was not true. Galland explained that the wreckage was sitting in Aachen. Goering replied that any American fighters found that far east must have been shot down farther west and glided into Germany, an aerodynamic impossibility, since no pilot glides toward enemy territory. When Galland pressed the point, Goering stated that he was issuing an official order. The American fighters had not been there, and this was to be reported to the Führer. Adolf Galland, Germany's general of the fighter arm, responded with what Speer described as an unforgettable smile. Orders are orders. Sir, to understand why this conversation happened, why the most senior Luftwaffe commander would rather issue an order contradicting physical evidence than acknowledge what was sitting in a German field, you have to understand what Germany had been told about American production capacity and what they chose to do with that information. In 1940, Adolf Hitler's government had access to accurate data on American industrial output. The real numbers were available through open-source analysis of American business publications, through trade journals, through manufacturing reports that American companies published without restriction because they were proud of what they were doing. Germany knew what the Detroit automotive industry was capable of. Germany knew how many factory workers America had, how much steel it produced annually, how quickly its industrial base could be converted from peacetime to wartime goods. The United States Strategic Bombing Survey, which interrogated German leaders after the war, found this in its Aircraft Division report published in 1945. The basic error made by Germany was probably Hitler's failure to increase the aircraft program at the time the Allies began the combined bomber offensive. It is known that accurate information as to the plans and programs for building of aircraft in the United States was available to him, but he and Göring dismissed the figures as false and impossible. Germany had the numbers, looked at them, and decided the numbers were lying. Göring's explanation to American interrogators after the war had a certain honesty to it. He told Major Kenneth Heckler at POW Camp No. 32 on the 25th of July, 1945, that he had told Hitler to take America seriously, that he had warned about the automobile industry's conversion potential. But he also said that Hitler was convinced America would not intervene because of its bad experience in World War I, and that Hitler governed by extreme contempt and underestimation of the others. Albert Speer framed it more precisely in a memorandum he wrote to Hitler in 1944, describing the war as a contest between two systems of organization: Germany's outmoded, tradition-bound, and arthritic organizational system against American mass production built on Henry Ford's methods. By the time Speer wrote that memo, the result was no longer in serious doubt. The man who did more than anyone else to prove Speer right was a 9-year-old Danish immigrant named Charles Sorensen, who had joined Ford Motor Company in 1904 as a pattern maker at $3 a day. In January 1941, Sorensen flew to San Diego to visit Consolidated Aircraft's factory, where they were building B-24 Liberator bombers. He watched workers in the California sunshine assembling bombers partially outdoors, moving components by hand, fabricating parts on site. Sorensen had spent 37 years building cars and had never seen anything as inefficient in his life. That night, in a room at the Coronado Hotel, he sketched out a floor plan on hotel notepaper. A mile-long indoor assembly line. A building covering 3.5 million square feet with its own airfield attached 6 runways, 1,484 acres. Workers would stand at fixed stations. The airplane would come to them, on a moving line, the same way a Ford car came together in Detroit. Sorensen's sketch became the Willow Run plant. Groundbreaking was the 18th of April, 1941. The first complete Ford-built B-24 rolled off the line in September 1942. The first 2 years were rough, constant Army design changes, workers who had never seen a bomber struggling to learn tolerances measured in thousandths of an inch, a turnover rate so severe that in 1 month Ford hired 2,900 workers and lost 3,100. Journalists mocked the plant. One magazine piece called it, "Will It Run?" By the spring of 1944, the answer was clear. Between April 24 and the 26th of April 1944, 100 completed B-24 bombers flew away from Willow Run in 2 days, one every 43 minutes. At peak capacity, the plant was delivering 1 bomber every 63 minutes, 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. The total Willow Run output across the war was approximately 8,685 complete. B-24 Liberators, roughly half of the 18,482 Liberators built in total, making the B-24 the most produced multi-engine aircraft in history. All of them came from a sketch on hotel notepaper made by a pattern maker from Copenhagen. Willow Run was not unique. General Motors converted 5 East Coast automotive plants into the Eastern Aircraft Division and built approximately 15,700 aircraft Wildcats and Avengers for the Navy. Curtiss-Wright, with 180,000 workers at peak, produced 29,269 airplanes and 142,840 aircraft engines. North American Aviation built 15,586 P-51s, nearly 10,000 B-25 Mitchell bombers, and 15,495 AT-6 Texan trainers. The total American military aircraft output for 1,944 was 95,272 aircraft. The peak production month was March, 1,944, 9,086 American military aircraft in 31 days. The Army Air Force's official statisticians noted that this figure came close to equaling the combined production for the same period of the other four major powers. Germany's response to the escort fighter crisis and the losses of early 1944 was not nothing. Germany's fighter production in 1944 was genuinely remarkable as a feat of industrial mobilization under bombing. In the 6 days between February 20 and the 25th of February 1944, a period American planners called Big Week, the USAAF and RAF hit German aircraft factories at Leipzig, Regensburg, Augsburg, Brunswick, and Gotha, with over 600 escort fighters per day. The Luftwaffe lost 262 fighters and roughly 100 pilots killed. Albert Speer, the armaments minister, organized the response. On the 1st of March 1944, he established the Jägerstab, the fighter staff, under the day-to-day direction of Karl Otto Sauer, a production bureaucrat with nearly unlimited authority over labor, materials, and manufacturing priorities. The Jägerstab extended work weeks to 72 hours. It dispersed aircraft production into forests, caves, and converted factories outside the bombing corridors. It accepted an offer from Heinrich Himmler, delivered the 9th of March 1944, of 100,000 concentration camp prisoners as forced labor. By September 1944, German single-engine fighter production peaked at approximately 3,000 per month, genuinely close to the Jägernaut program's stated target. What Germany could not produce, what no production program could conjure from a decree, was the pilots to fly those airframes, the fuel to power them, and the time in which experienced men taught inexperienced men how to stay alive. The numbers on Luftwaffe pilot training are as damning as the production numbers. Before the war, a German fighter pilot received over 250 hours of flight training before reaching a combat unit. By 1942, that number was around 210 hours. By mid-1944, it had dropped to approximately 112 hours total, with perhaps 15 to 20 hours on the actual aircraft type they would fly in combat. At that same moment, a new American pilot arriving in England had approximately 400 hours in the logbook, nearly half on operational aircraft. The attrition that created this training collapse was relentless. In the first 4 months of 1944, the Luftwaffe lost 1,000 fighter pilots, not aircraft, pilots. In March 1944 alone, 511 pilots were killed or missing, roughly 21% of available fighter strength. In the first half of 1944, Home Defense Day fighter units lost approximately 2,000 pilots killed, missing, or wounded, a complete replacement of the entire fighter pilot force in 5 months. Men with 100 victories, men who had been flying since Spain, men whose experience was irreplaceable, died at a rate the training system could not begin to match. Of the 107 German pilots ever credited with 100 or more aerial victories, only 8 entered frontline service after June 1942. In post-war interviews and in his 1954 memoir, The First and the Last, Adolf Galland described watching new pilots arrive at combat units with so few hours that they were a danger primarily to themselves. The technical standard of the German fighter pilot, he wrote, had fallen so far that by 1944 the problem was not with numbers, but with experienced pilots. The Allied bombing of synthetic fuel plants that began in May 1944 made the training problem irreversible. By late July 1944, Allied bombing had cut German aviation fuel production by 98%. Training schools could not keep their aircraft flying. Instructors were pulled from teaching assignments and sent to combat units. By the autumn of 1944, pilots were being graduated with total flight hours that would have been considered dangerously inadequate for solo flight in peacetime. Albert Speer made a dark joke to Galland about it. The armaments industry had won the first round. It was building more aircraft than ever, but the pilots to fly them were simply not there. What Lieutenant General James Doolittle did with American fighters matters enormously, because production numbers without doctrine are just metal sitting on a runway. When Doolittle took command of the 8th Air Force on the 6th of January 1944, he visited Major General William Kepner at 8th Fighter Command. On the wall was a sign, "The first duty of 8th Air Force fighters is to bring the bombers back alive." Doolittle ordered it taken down and replaced it with, "The first duty of 8th Air Force fighters is to destroy German fighters." That change was a complete reversal of strategic logic. The old doctrine kept fighters tied to the bombers circling, shepherding, defensive. The new doctrine freed fighters to hunt. They ranged 50 miles ahead of the bomber stream, climbing above where the Luftwaffe gathered to intercept, hitting German fighters before they could form up. After escort duty over the target, they came down low on the way home and strafed airfields, shooting up aircraft on the ground, hitting fuel trucks and maintenance facilities. Galland later described the practical consequence to Doolittle personally. "The day American fighters stopped orbiting bombers and went after Luftwaffe fighters instead," he said, "Germany lost the air war." The numbers bear this out clearly. The average monthly bomber loss rate for the 8th Air Force ran at 5.1% in 1943. In 1944, under the new doctrine with P-51 escorts, it fell to 1.9%. When Schweinfurt was attacked again on the 24th of February 1944, 4 months after Black Thursday, 11 bombers were lost, compared to 60 on October 14. The difference between those two missions was the escort fighters and the doctrine that told those fighters to kill rather than guard. By the summer of 1944, the German leadership was simultaneously producing more fighter aircraft than at any point in the war, while arguing internally about whether to believe the scale of American production they already knew was happening. The 3rd of July 1944 declaration of the Jägernaut program, the emergency fighter program, was Germany's formal acknowledgement of the crisis. Piston engine bomber production was curtailed or cancelled outright. The Heinkel He 177, Germany's heavy bomber program, was deleted. The single-engine fighter target was set at 3,800 per month, including 500 Me 262 jet fighters. This was the 3,000 aircraft promise that Germany was making to itself in the middle of 1944, a target it never reached. The context in which Germany made this promise, In the month of July 1944, American factories delivered 8,464 military aircraft. Germany's entire emergency fighter program was aimed at a monthly production level that America had already been exceeding for months. The internal breakpoint came in January 1945. Germany was producing more fighters than at any previous point in the war, and the Luftwaffe was being systematically destroyed on every front. Galland had been warning about the crisis for over a year. In late 1943 and through 1944, he filed reports, argued in meetings, and told anyone who would listen that the problem was not airframes, but pilots and fuel. Johannes Steinhoff, 176 aerial victories, commander of JG-77, told Goering that the fighter arm was being destroyed by impossible tasking and inadequate replacements. Günther Lützow, credited with 110 victories, said the same. One after another, the men who had built the Luftwaffe's reputation for combat effectiveness told their commanders that the organization was failing and explained why, and one after another they were dismissed, threatened, or shuffled sideways. Around January 12-13, 1945, Galland was relieved of command as general of the fighter arm, with Goering accusing him of defeatism. The formal break came at a meeting arranged by Luftwaffe Chief of Staff Karl Kohler at the Haus der Flieger in Berlin, approximately the 19th of January, 1945. Galland himself was not present, he had already been removed, but the senior fighter aces were. They presented their demands formally. End the accusations of cowardice against fighter pilots, release the Me-262S for fighter operations rather than bomber attacks, and stop deploying fighter units against impossible odds with replacement pilots who had fewer hours than their maintenance crews. Goering's response, as recorded in Karl Kohler's diary and corroborated by post-war accounts, was to threaten court-martial. He told Steinhoff he was banned from all airfields and would be tried for mutiny. He told Lützow he would be shot for treason and posted him to Italy. Hitler ultimately intervened not in favor of the pilots' demands, but to stop Goering from shooting Germany's most decorated officers in the middle of a war. Galland was told he could form a small jet fighter unit, which became Jagdverband 44. He was given 16 Me-262S and permission to recruit aces from wherever he could find them. By the spring of 1945, JV-44 was flying with perhaps the highest concentration of decorated pilots of any single squadron in Luftwaffe history, with no fuel, no parts, and roughly 4 weeks left before the war ended. Lützow vanished on the 24th of April 1945, flying an Me-262. Steinhoff was burned nearly to death in a Me-262 crash on the 18th of April 1945, when his landing gear failed on takeoff at München-Riem and the aircraft struck a bomb crater. Galland was shot down by a P-47 on the 26th of April 1945, took a shell fragment in the knee, and survived the war. He later moved to Argentina, flew for the Argentine Air Force in the early 1950s, and eventually returned to Germany. He died in 1996, 84 years old, still giving interviews about what went wrong. After the war, Goering sat in a cell at POW Camp No. 32 and gave his account of events to Major Heckler in July 1945. He acknowledged that long-range fighters had delivered a major strategic blow to German planning, and that when American escort fighters appeared over Berlin, he found the situation tragic. He had told Hitler to take America seriously. He had warned about the automotive industry's conversion potential. Hitler had dismissed it because he believed America would not enter the war, and when America entered the war and did exactly what Göring had said it would do, the logic that had governed German air planning simply stopped working, and neither Göring nor Hitler could bring themselves to act as though the numbers they had been given were real. The USSBS's verdict was straightforward. Germany's fundamental error was the failure to respond appropriately when they still could have, in the face of intelligence they already possessed. Albert Speer, in a December 1944 speech to armaments workers, acknowledged the paradox that had defined the last year of Germany's air war. The industry had succeeded. Germany was building more fighters in 1944 than anyone had imagined possible in 1940 or 1941. The Jägerstab had done its job. The factories were running. The aircraft were rolling off the lines. Speer reportedly told Galland that the armaments industry had won its round. The aircraft sat on dispersal fields without fuel, flown by pilots with 80 hours in their logbooks, maintained by ground crews who no longer had the parts to keep them airworthy, waiting for missions that could not be completed because the men qualified to complete them were already dead. Germany lost the air war not because it failed to build aircraft. It built an extraordinary number of aircraft under extraordinarily difficult conditions. Germany lost the air war because it looked at numbers that were freely available to anyone paying attention and decided those numbers were impossible, and by the time it accepted them as real, the men who might have made those numbers matter were gone. William Knudsen, the Danish-born former GM president, whom Roosevelt personally commissioned as a lieutenant general, the only civilian ever given that rank, summed it up after the war. "We won because we smothered the enemy in an avalanche of production, the like of which he had never seen nor dreamed possible." He was right on both counts. Germany had never seen it, and they had been told, in advance, exactly what was coming.